told me later that he'd made up his mind that day that he wanted me for his wife. We married a year later. Aunt Melbourne was more than happy to have me off her hands. Midsummer Eve was the eve of my wedding. I was finishing the last of my packing that night. I took what I thought was a last look around the house. Suddenly, and I don't know why, I remembered my skates. And that made me remember you. It had been so long since I'd seen you, and I knew I had to leave them there, in the wardrobe where we'd agreed. I wrote a note to go with them.
I found the note, signed and dated.
In one of the last years of the old century. That night was very hot, and I was so excited I couldn't sleep. I thought of my wedding the next day, and for the first time, I thought of all I'd be leaving behind me. My childhood, all the time I'd spent in the garden, all the time I'd spent with you, Tom.
You remembered me?
That night, there was a thunderstorm with the most brilliant lightning I was ever to see. Aunt Melbourne was away in London. I stood at her sitting room window and looked out over the garden. The lightning flashes made everything very clear. I could see every tree, every bush, every memory. And when I looked down, I could see you. You were standing at the back of the house, and you looked as thin through as a piece of moonshine. You went indoors, and that was the last I saw of you. I said to myself, he's gone, but the garden is here. The garden will always be here. It will never change. At the far end of the garden, there was a ruin.
With an old tree growing out of it.
That midsummer eve, when the storm was at its worst, a great wind caught the tree, and the lightning struck it. It fell.
You cried out.
It was then I realized, Tom, that of course the garden was changing. All the time. Nothing stands still, except in our memory. When the house was being sold, Barty and I came over for the auction. The past I had escaped from, but which was so much part of me, was up for sale. I stood with Barty in front of the mantel, in what was once the parlour. In that place where I had stood on Christmas Eve, the night I realized that Barty loved me and that I loved him. The house was already quite different by then. Colder, sadder, emptier. But the clock, our clock, was still there. Still ticking, still alive. Something that day, some feeling, some vestige of memory, drew me back to what was left of the garden. Somehow I knew that Trixie would survive. Barty sensed that that tree, that place, held a special meaning for me, even though I could never really explain why to him. To know that it was important to me was enough for him. Very much in love, Barty and I stood together beneath Trixie's branches as the world around us continued to change. By the end of that day, there would be just one tree still standing in what was once our garden. Trixie. It's in its very own, very much smaller garden now. I hope whoever owns it takes good care of it.
Did Barty buy the clock for you?
Yes. Barty bought the house and the clock. I'd always loved it, loved to hear it striking.
But you didn't come to live here. Not then.
No. We had a home in the Fens, And we were content there, more than. We had 2 children. 2 boys. They were both killed in the Great War. The First World War, we call it now. And then many years later, Barty died. Peacefully, in my arms. I was left quite alone. And that was when I came here. And I've lived here ever since.
Since you've come here, you've often gone back in time, haven't you? Back into the past.
Oh, yes, Tom. When you're my age, you live in the past. You remember it. You dream it.
These last few nights, you've hardly dreamt about the garden at all. You've been dreaming of winter and skating and Barty.
Yes. Of growing up. Of love. Of Barty.
I suppose you couldn't really help that if you were growing up.
You were getting thinner and thinner every time I saw you, Tom. The last time we were together, you seemed to vanish away.
So last night?
I dreamt of my wedding and of leaving here.
Last night, I called to you, but I never really thought you would hear me.
You woke me, but I didn't mind. I knew it was Tom calling for help. I couldn't believe you were real.
We're both real, then and now. It's as the pendulum says. Time no longer. Do you think our marks still show on Trixie?
I dreamed they do. How is that brother of yours? What was his name?
Peter.
Peter. Will you bring him to visit me next time you come?
I promise. And you and I, we keep our promises.
We do. Until the next time, goodbye, Tom.
Goodbye, Hap. Goodbye, Mrs. Bartholomew. Goodbye, Mattie.
When he ran up to her and they hugged each other, it was as if they'd known each other for years and years instead of only having met for the first time this morning. There was something else, Alan. I know you say this sounds even more absurd. Mrs. Bartholomew was an old woman and hardly bigger than Tom, but when he put his arms around her and they hugged each other goodbye, it was as if... it was as if she were a little girl.
Stop! Stop the car!
Tom!
Tom, what are you doing?
I'm sorry, sir, but do you have a garden?
A small one, yes. Would you care to see it?
Tom, what are you doing?
I'm so sorry, but...
I'm sorry. Good morning.